I'm going to talk about the question of how do we actually assess system trustworthiness. This has been especially driven by Nadine Schlicker of the University of Marburg, my PhD student, and I want to give a big shout out to her. I think she's not going to be here today, but any praise for what I'm talking about today or any criticism, you can direct to Nadine also, because she's really a driving force here. And I really wanted to mention that. Okay, so let's start off. A topic that I personally cannot hear anymore, but I just start with it. GPT. Some of you may have heard of that thing that is out there, this ChatGPT system, that AI-based system that gives you any output that you basically want. And I think one big question that many people have when they interact with a GPT is, should I trust this thing? Should I trust the outputs of that thing? And how do I actually assess whether what this thing says is trustworthy? And if you start off with ChatGPT for the first time, you will start on that page, on a landing page. You see where you can input the messages and the questions or whatever you want to talk to GPT. And down there in very small, and I zoomed in a bit, you see that little sign that says free research preview. GPT may produce inaccurate information about people, places, or facts. This doesn't sound so trustworthy to me in the first place. It sounds like, oh, this thing doesn't produce accurate outputs. Okay, I should probably be a bit wary now what I do with it. And then you may interact with that thing. And for people who interacted with it on research topics, they may have heard things like, if you ask GPT about, oh, hey, who actually wrote On the Origin of Species, or if you ask it for references, it sometimes gives out a little bit strange and not that accurate references. So maybe it says it was written by Johannes Krauss, Johannes Basch, and that's probably not true because that was Darwin. And I believe Johannes has many good and trustworthy characteristics, but not being 170 years old. So another sign that could tell you that's not really trustworthy what the thing is doing. But maybe in future, when the EU Commission says we have some little certificates that we want to give out to AI systems, and we call it a trustworthy AI because it has been certified, it has been tested, maybe that tells us a different story, and we see that little certificate that is on the left side of in the future GPT versions that tells it's a trustworthy AI. And if I see that, I could say, oh, okay, it has been tested in the past, maybe it is trustworthy. And all of these things that I just told you about are what we say cues to trustworthiness or cues to the absence of trustworthiness. And that is where our idea starts. So a step back is still the question of how do we actually assess a system's trustworthiness? If we see a system, how do we get to the point to say, this seems to be trustworthy, I should use that, I can rely on it, or this seems to be not so trustworthy, I will not use it for my work, for instance. And what I'm going to talk about today is first a little bit related work to just embed it in the research that I am aware of on the topic of trust, at where I'm coming from. Then I will present you the trustworthiness assessment model, which has been developed by Nadine Schlicker and myself, and then some implications of that model. So let's start off with the related work. I am by training an industrial and organizational psychologist. And in IO psychology, there is one very influential model on trust between people, actually. It is the model by Myerdal from 1995. Some of you may have seen it, may have heard of it. I find it pretty nice because it's really clear. It tells about the concepts that I also believe are very important in this entire area. And that model basically starts with the question, okay, you as a truster, you see someone as a trustee, and you want that trustee to do some task that is important to you. When do you really trust that person? When do you let that person do a task for you? And that model would say you first have to see whether that person is trustworthy or not. So that's the first box here, this perceived trustworthiness. And perceived trustworthiness, for Meyer, he says there are three big facets of perceived trustworthiness. The ability of a person, so is that person able to conduct that task? The benevolence of that person, is that person doing things because they want to do it for me, or are they just doing those things out of own interest? And the integrity of that person, which is basically, is that person acting in a predictable way? Is this person acting consistently over time, or is this sometimes this person does this and then the person does not follow their word? And it doesn't matter what kind of facets you want to put into this perceived trustworthiness. I think we can agree the perceived trustworthiness of a person depends on different facets. Those three are just proposed by Meyer. And in that model, the next step would then be the trust in that other person, in the trustee. And Meyer has a pretty nice and often cited definition of trust. I'll just read it to you quickly, or not really quickly because it's very long. Trust is the willingness of a party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party based on the expectation that the other will perform a particular action important to the truster, irrespective of the ability to monitor or control that other party. So far, so good. This is a very nice, in my opinion, definition of trust, because it includes many of the important facets of trust. It is something that relates to an expectation towards another person. It relates to a situation or a task that is important to the truster. And it says, if you monitor or control another party all the time, that's not really trust. And I'm not going to talk that much more about trust now, but the model just says, if you have a high perceived trustworthiness of a person, that will make it more likely that you trust that person, under consideration of your own trust propensity, which is basically a personality trait like stable thing. Some people are more likely to trust. Some people are develop trust easier than others. That's that trust propensity. And then under the consideration of risk of the situation, you then decide whether you want to show trusting behavior, whether you tell that other person, hey, please do that task for me. Please screen those applicants for me. Please look at those medical images for me. If the risk is very high, you will really have to have a lot of trust in that other person before you say, please do that for me. If the risk is not that high, you will say, okay, yeah, do that, not that important. Let's see what happens. And then you observe what happens. The other person performs very well, and then you will update your perceived trustworthiness of that other person. Okay, sounds good. The person did their job quickly, efficiently, effectively, seems to be an able person for that task. Or the person does some strange things. You see that that person starts to discriminate against minorities, and you think, oh, I shouldn't trust that person in the future. The perceived trustworthiness gets down, gets lower. And that's basically the Meyer model. But the gap that we saw in that model is that we don't really know how to get to that perceived trustworthiness. The model starts with, there's a perception of trustworthiness, but where does this perception of trustworthiness come from? And that is the true in the case of people as trustees, and that is also true in the case of systems as trustees. You can neatly just translate that model to systems, and you have pretty similar assumptions. But the open question still remains, how do we get from the actual trustworthiness of a trustee to the perceived trustworthiness? And that is basically where our trustworthiness assessment model jumps in. But for the ones of you who may have heard of another influential trust model in especially the trust in automation literature, Lee and C, I just want to make a short detour and talk about that, because the Lee and C model is very influential trust model in the trust in automation literature. And what Lee and C did, they basically translated the entire Meyer model that I just presented to you to the area of trust in automated systems. And what they did was they also translated the facets of trustworthiness from human to more facets that apply to automated systems. For instance, they said ability, we translate to performance, the performance of a system. Benevolence, a system cannot really be benevolent, and I agree with that. They told us that's rather the purpose. For what is that system going to be used? And for integrity, they said that's the process. They called it process, which is basically the degree to which the automation's algorithms are appropriate for the situation, able to achieve the operator's goals. I don't like that definitions that much, but what I really don't like is that what Lee and C did, they translated perceived trustworthiness to basis of trust, instead of just naming it also perceived trustworthiness. And then things in the trust and automation literature got a little bit detoured because people mixed trustworthiness and trust, and that's a bit problematic in my opinion. But if you want to see the Lee and C model, which I also don't like that much because I find it very convoluted, I don't know anything what is going on here, but our trustworthiness assessment model can also just jump in at two places here in that model. I don't want to talk about that too much. Let's go back to the nice model, to the Meyer model, and then we can go to the trustworthiness assessment model now. What we are now contributing here, or would be what is really like work in progress, and we were also happy for any feedback. So the basic idea of the trustworthiness assessment model is that we are building on two models from psychology that basically tell how people assess unobservable characteristics of other people. So a latent construct in psychology would be personality, or would be the intelligence of a person. You cannot observe that. You cannot directly see how intelligent is that person or how extroverted is that person. That's something that is in that person. And to perceive that latent construct, you need to rely on observable cues. So these little circles in the middle. And on the one side, you have the latent constructs. You see those cues, you assess those cues to arrive at your perception of that construct. To give you a little example, here on the right side, the person in the purple shirt, he has very colorful wardrobe, he is very talkative, and his hobby is he acts as a clown. So if you see those cues, you could probably tell that person seems to be extroverted. To a certain degree, that person is extroverted and maybe even more extroverted than the person on the left. Those cues can be relevant. They can be good to assess their extroversion, but some of those cues may also be misleading. Because if you only rely on the colorful wardrobe to judge whether another person is extroverted, you would maybe judge those people to be extroverted. I'm not saying they are not extroverted, but it's not really the best cue to assess their extroversion. And now back to trustworthiness. Our assumption is that to assess trustworthiness is also something that is not directly observable. That's also one of those latent constructs. And to get from the latent construct to your perception of that construct, you also need to assess those cues. And now let's move to the model that we developed. So our assumption is on the system side, there's an actual trustworthiness of the system. On the truster side, so on the person side, we have the perceived trustworthiness of the system. So far, so not so complex. Now it's getting a bit more complex because this actual trustworthiness of the system, we say, is part of the system's characteristics. What are systems characteristics? We assume that those system characteristics are everything that could possibly be known about that system. So if you would be God and if you would have perfect knowledge about the system and what it can and cannot do, that's the system characteristics. They are assumed to be rather objective facts about the system. The system is 90% accurate. Something like that would be a system characteristic. But actual trustworthiness, we now assume, depends on the individual standards of trustworthiness that the person has. So basically, the actual trustworthiness always depends on the observer. To make that a bit clearer, you already see this little yellow, blue, and purple requirements lists. Let's zoom into them. For us, this individual standard for trustworthiness says or asks the question, what makes a system trustworthy for me? So for instance, to be trustworthy, the system has to be at least 90% accurate. I hope you already see the distinction between that and the system characteristics, because that has already a connotation of it has to be 90% accurate. System characteristics would just say it is 90% accurate. And now that you see this little requirement list is completely empty because it's just the individual standards. Now we get to the system's actual trustworthiness. This responds to the question, how trustworthy is the system actually with respect to my individual standards? So if I have this standard and I ask myself, how trustworthy is the system really? God would know that the system is in fact 90% accurate. You will not know that probably because you have to observe the cues that you get from the system. So this actual trustworthiness of the system is basically just a filled out requirements list if you would know everything about the system, which you never know. Now you observe the cues that the system gives you, and you can respond to the question, how trustworthy do I think the system is with respect to my individual standards? So in the end, I see some cues, I operate with the system, and I believe it's 85% accurate. So you see, this perception of trustworthiness in this case wouldn't be completely accurate because in fact, the system is 90% accurate, but you don't really know that because that can only be known by someone who has complete and perfect insight on the system. And that's different between the actual trustworthiness and the perceived trustworthiness. To make it maybe a bit more clear here, this is what you saw before. On the one side, you have the latent construct. On the downside, you have the perception of that construct. And what we see here is we need some observable cues to really perceive how trustworthy we perceive that system. So maybe one of those cues that we see are outputs by the system. Okay, the system gives us some outputs. Another cue that we get, our colleagues talk about the system. Another cue that we get, the system has some certification label on it that says it's a trustworthy AI. Another cue that we get, the system has some nice anthropomorphic look. And those are all cues that I could use to assess the system's trustworthiness. But not all of those cues are really relevant to accurately assess the trustworthiness of the system. On the side of the system, we assume that those cues to really lead to an accurate perception of system trustworthiness, they first need to be available. Because if you don't have those cues, you cannot assess anything. But those cues also have to be relevant. And some of those cues seem to be relevant, others less. For instance, the system output seems to be a relevant cue at first sight because it gives us some insight on what the system is actually doing and whether the system is producing accurate outputs. This anthropomorphic look of the system may not be relevant because you can design any system as an anthropomorphic agent, but that doesn't necessarily has to do anything to do with its trustworthiness. But people can use it still. So on the side of the person, we say to accurately assess systems trustworthiness, people need to detect cues. So if you don't see outputs, if you don't realize that there's a seal for trustworthy AI, you cannot really use those cues. And they need to accurately utilize those cues. If you see an output and you don't really utilize that output to form your perceived trustworthiness, that doesn't help that much. But if you see that anthropomorphic look and you say, oh, an anthropomorphic agent that is very trustworthy, then you use a queue that is not really relevant, in our case here, to assess the actual trustworthiness of the system. So those four things, availability, relevance, detection, and utilization, all need to be there to accurately assess the trustworthiness of the system, which is a very important thing. As we said in the beginning, we want to use systems in situations where they are accurate, and we don't want to use them in situations where they are not really trustworthy, where they give us not so accurate outputs, for instance. Yeah, the example for the anthropomorphic robot is my favorite one, because anthropomorphism in many meta-analyses in psychology has been shown to affect people's trust in systems, but it's probably most of the time not really an accurate cue for its real trustworthiness. So for that point of our model, we can basically summarize that different trusters may arrive at different perceptions of system trustworthiness, although the system characteristics may stay exactly the same due to different individual standards. If I have lower standards than you, I will probably say, oh, that system that is 80% accurate is trustworthy. But if you have the standard that it has to be 90% trustworthy, you will have a different final assessment of its trustworthiness. We can also arrive at different perceptions of trustworthiness due to different availability of queues. Maybe I have administrator rights for that system, and I can look into training data, I can look into raw data, and you cannot. And that is why some queues may not be available to you. Due to different detection abilities, maybe I have a higher situation awareness than you have. I see different queues and I can use them, and you overlook those queues. And due to different utilization, maybe you have a higher expertise in interacting with the system. Maybe you know much more about the task, and you can more adequately say, that queue tells me that's not a trustworthy output. And that's the first part of that model. I know it's hard, it's a little bit complex. I hope you bear with me. I hope you stay with me. You can ask some questions at the end. Now comes the, I would say, easier part of the model, because when we developed the model, at some point we realized, okay, we are on a very micro level of trustworthiness assessment. It is really always this kind of a person sits in front of a computer or interacts with a robot and then assesses the trustworthiness. But that usually happens in a societal and social context. The person is usually not alone. The system has been implemented in an organization or as part of the government. So there's more to it. So we zoom out now to a macro level perspective on trustworthiness assessment, where we say that those trustworthiness assessments of single persons propagate. If you are a person who thinks a system is very, very trustworthy, you may produce cues to other people that tell them, hey, Markus really likes the system. Let's give it a try. It seems to be trustworthy for him. If you don't like the system, if you're one of those people who don't like GPT that much, you tell people, oh, it always gives us this inaccurate outputs. You shouldn't really use that. So you produce cues that tell about the absence of the system trustworthiness. So in the end, on the right side, you see that little macro level view, which basically just says trustworthiness assessments on a micro level. So for single stakeholders, propagate between those trusters. You, on the one hand, have primary cues, where we say they stem from the system itself. So outputs by the system, for instance, you can use them to assess system trustworthiness. But there are also secondary cues, and those stem from other trusters. The best example for that are those trustworthiness certificates. They will be produced by people who have already assessed the system's trustworthiness and then give that certification label that tells you, oh, that's a trustworthy system. Or your colleagues tell you that's a trustworthy system, and you can use that as additional cues. And those secondary cues are pretty nice because they make this entire process more efficient. If you always would have to make this entire trustworthiness assessment, that's very demanding. But if you get those secondary cues, you can already rely on another person that says, this is a trustworthy system. You can trust me that this is a trustworthy system. The problem now becomes, especially the one of diverging individual standards. Everyone who assesses the trustworthiness of the system has probably a little bit different individual standards. Example, Alice says a medical AI system has to produce fair outputs. Bob says, I agree, this system does produce fair outputs. Alice says, amazing, this indicates the presence of trustworthiness for me. What's the problem here? What kind of fairness are we talking about? Are we talking about fairness for male and female patients? Are we talking about fairness with respect to hit rates or false alarms rates? If they don't talk about this, this is basically just Bob producing a secondary cue that Alice then uses, but maybe not, that the cue is not really in line with her individual standards, which may not align with the understanding of fairness that Bob has. All right, 3 minutes left on my clock. So now we come to the implications of that model that we see. First, I think what is really important here, we're really trying to be here. We're really trying to clarify how from actual trustworthiness we get to perceived trustworthiness. That's the basic implication of the model. That's the one takeaway that I hope you got from the model. That's what we try to solve. And this is what it would look like if we would do our little model here, but it doesn't look that good. So I'll just skip that. The implications that we see on a micro level of a model are especially with respect to those cues. On the system side, you need to ask yourselves, how can we make relevant cues available? But first, we need to know what are relevant cues. How can we design, as system designers, those relevant cues? And how can we make those cues available? That leads us to things like explainable AI, where you have approaches that try to get some insights from the system out to people. If you only have outputs that says, this person is a good applicant, this person is not so good applicant, that doesn't tell us that much. But if you have additional explanations for that, you can make those cues for trustworthiness more available. But now we have to ask, are they also relevant? And on the human side, we have to ask ourselves, how can we prepare users to really detect relevant cues and maybe ignore irrelevant cues? And how can we make humans better at utilizing the correct cues? How can we prepare them to adequately weigh different cues to then in the end assess the system's trustworthiness accurately? And on a macro level, we have the implication that the secondary cues can make the trustworthiness assessment more efficient, but they're also a bit dangerous. Because if you don't communicate your standards behind those secondary cues, they can mislead people. Such trustworthiness certificates, they can mislead people in believing that such systems are trustworthy. You can compare that with certified green investment if you're investing, or you can compare that with Bio-Siegel. If you go to a grocery shopping and you see, oh, that is bio, I want bio, but you don't really know what bio actually means. You only trust that certificate, but you don't know what is behind that. If you look behind it, you will probably be a bit disappointed what bio often means. So it's the implication of we should also talk about the standards of trustworthiness if we tell other people this is a trustworthy system. If we have those certificates, we need to talk about those standards. And what is also the implication is that the trustworthiness of other trusters will also affect the system trustworthiness assessments. Because if you have a secondary cue produced by the EU, by the European Union, and you don't really trust in the European Union, you'll also not trust that secondary cue, probably. And just a quick outlook of what we are working on right now to further develop that model. First, as we are psychologists, we also want to do some empirical work here, and we are asking ourselves, okay, how can we now measure the influence of single cues, of a combination of cues? Should we do some eye tracking studies here to see what kind of cues people look at and how they assess it? How can we actually measure the relevance of those cues? And how can we also measure those individual standards? Because people may be notoriously bad in telling us, hey, what do you expect from that system? What do you expect from that system to be trustworthy? And also, there's some more conceptual work to do. What we think is an implication of our model is that there is a difference between an accurate trustworthiness assessment and a justified trustworthiness assessment. Accurate would mean my perceived trustworthiness and the system's actual trustworthiness, they match. They match, and I can, to let's say 95% overlap, assess the system's trustworthiness accurately. But a justified trustworthiness assessment would only mean I can appropriately utilize and detect available cues. Because if there are no cues available, if all the cues that are available are not relevant, can we really say that this person has not calibrated trust, has not an accurate trustworthiness assessment? If the person uses everything that is available in a perfect way, and the person in the end says, this is my trustworthiness assessment, but the system produced an incorrect output, can we say that this person did that unjustifiedly? It followed the system unjustifiedly? Probably there has to be something like the most accurate possible assessment given all that the truster can know. And also one implication of that entire thing is, what is actually trust? What is actually calibrated trust? I'm really interested in what John tells us later on that topic, because this is an ongoing discussion also among the author team. And if you look into the paper, because it's also preprint out there, you will see this figure here where we try to define what trust actually is. I will not go into detail here, because this would open another half an hour of discussion of what is all in that little trust circle here. But yeah, that's basically the end of my talk. As I said, props to Nadine, who has really done great work here. And I hope you are inspired a bit of the trustworthiness assessment model. If you want to look into the preprint, here's a QR code. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Markus, for enlightening us. Yeah, really interesting take. So it's the second time within 1 week I listening to this model. I get it presented last time by Nadine on the ROVE conference. So yeah, really interesting, and there are a lot of questions in my mind right now. The first one would actually have been, what is trust in your model? But you already mentioned in your last slide that this is an open question. So, but whatsoever, so you label, so the label uses trustworthiness or perceived trustworthiness, assessed trustworthiness. Is this the whole story, or is there more to trust still? Is there other variables relevant that can be labeled trust, or is that now what we should label trust?
I mean, that's basically also the question of what is trust. And I mean, I can talk a bit about it, what we believe is. I mean, I can just show you the little clock for a second. In the end, what we think happens is that you have this circle, and this circle gets filled with your perceptions of things that indicate the presence of trustworthiness and things that indicate the absence of trustworthiness. And then there's some remaining uncertainty. So these are the three slices of that circle. In the beginning, if you don't know anything about the system, it's completely full with uncertainty. I have no idea what is happening here. With everything that you get to know about the thing, you can say for some things, oh, this seems to be working pretty well for female applicants. And then at some point you realize, but it doesn't work well for female applicants above the age of 50. And that will fill your circle with some knowledge. So with your perceived trustworthiness indicating the presence and the absence of trustworthiness. And what we then say is, we still, to really trust, or to really engage in trusting behavior, we need some gap filler, because there's still some uncertainty. There will always remain uncertainty. And that gap filler, that's basically trust for us. To fill the gap between, I know some stuff about you as a trustee. I'm sure that you can do that. I'm sure that you cannot do that, but I'm really unsure if you will betray me or anything else that leads us to that uncertainty. And that is that kind of, I consider trusting you as soon as I have enough evidence for your presence of trustworthiness. So, and that's basically that gap filler would then be trust. And depending on the risk of the situation, you would then decide whether you really engage in trusting behavior. So that's in short what we right now. Yeah.
So trust is the remaining uncertainty. Did I get that right? Or is it like what is the basis of still deciding to use or rely on a system in the presence of a rest or a high quantity of this uncertainty? Cake slice here, I would say.
Is it basically the consideration of, can I gap that rest of uncertainty?
Okay,
can I gap the uncertainty, and can I also gap the absence of trustworthiness? So, and that's basically what in our model still, where we still see trust as something that could be required, that could come into the model. Because in the beginning we said, do we need trust? Hey, we were at the point where we said, hey, can we just remove it now? But then we were at the point where we said, no, maybe it is really that kind of, some things about the trustee, that there are some presence of trustworthiness, there are some absence of trustworthiness, and then there's some remaining uncertainty. And how do we gap that now? That there is uncertainty, that I know that the system cannot do some things good. And that's basically what we thought then could be that. And I mean, that's also in line with some of the work on trust, that is that gap filling, that it is that social bridge that bridges this kind of, I'm a little bit uncertain, but I know enough to then consider trusting you.
But it's really interesting because it's also including the paradoxon that the more you know, so the more information you have to actually about the trustworthiness, the less relevant trust might become for behavior in the end, right?
Correct.
So, and this is kind of also what I find really appealing, because when we talk about trustworthy systems, we talk about explainability, or we talk about user interfaces that communicate the trustworthiness and so on. But these trustworthy systems in the end do not need trust anymore because they're completely transparent, right? So this is really an interesting paradox.
And that is exactly also where some of these ideas came from, because in the computer science literature, you have the concept of dependable systems or trustless systems.
Mm-hmm.
If they are so trustworthy that you can predict everything, that you can explain everything, if you have no uncertainty left, then you don't need trust. And that's I also think what is correct. You don't need trust if this thing, if you always know what it does, if you can always predict what it does, then you don't need trust. Exactly. If this entire cycle would be full with knowledge of anything, that you don't need trust, because you always know when it will work perfectly, you will always know when it doesn't work. You don't have any uncertainty left. I mean, that's a
it's really interesting, and it's also touching on points we discussed yesterday, because so Linda Onash as well, right? And we will not so she's unfortunately not here today, but so one of her arguments would be, though, that in many cases we cannot observe a mediation from these trust cues or these perceived characteristics of the system wire trust as an attitude to actual alliance behavior. What would you say about that?
So why you don't see that relation between trust and behavior?
Yeah, because one conclusion might be, which is not what Linda does, but somebody who sees that results would say something like, well, why do we still talk about trust if it does not mediate the effect on behavior in the end?
I think the question really is how we measure it now. Because if you just measure trust with I trust the system, then I would also say that doesn't really capture what we're doing here. That doesn't really capture what the implications of our model would be. Because how you would measure it, if you really follow that model thing now, would be something like, I'm willing to gap the uncertainty that I still have. And I don't see that in any measure of trust in automation, at least. In the interpersonal trust literature, there are some of these measures that capture that kind of gap bridging thing. I really wonder whether the trustworthiness stuff corresponds more with behavior, but I'm also wary whether that's the case. In the end, there's much between assessing the trustworthiness and actually doing stuff. There's so much in between. And I mean, risk is one of those things. If you have so high risk that you don't, or not just risk, also this kind of, the company uses that thing, now I also have to use it. I don't trust it, but yeah, somebody told me to use it, then I will use it. Doesn't have to do anything with trust, probably, in some situations. So, yeah.
I still have a pretty large list of questions, so I cannot cover them all now. I will just ask one more question before we jump into the next talk. So this model is really cognitive in nature, right? How about just feeling good about the system or not? What would you say about the affective components?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. We always talked about that during the writing. How can we bring in some effective things? And then we said, yeah, but actually some effective things can also be the cues. I mean, if you have the feeling, I feel pretty good about that now, that could come in as some point of a cue there. But usually we'd say, okay, but is that really a cue that is now relevant and available? Because we always say it comes from it has to be some associated with the actual trustworthiness. Yeah, it is basically an really untouched point where this comes in the model now.
Okay, so are there any more questions from the others? Because there are none on YouTube right now. Still have 2 minutes left. John? Yeah, you have to unmute. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question, but I don't know if we have enough time to answer. We'll probably have to talk about it at some other point in time. But I was just thinking, what do we have to gain by using the word trust and trustworthiness that the word reliance and reliability and rely doesn't already provide us?
Yeah, I think the reliance word for me often implies I'm now doing that. I'm acting, I'm engaging in an act of, I rely on that system that it does something. I rely on the outputs of that system. And just from a psychological perspective, that's the final thing, I think. That's a very far in the process. And before that, I would say that you could also think that at least that trustworthiness part makes some sense. If you say the trustworthiness of the system, I'm unsure about it, I need some more information about it to really can then justifiably rely on the system, then I think that brings some contribution to the table. Yeah, you know what I mean? This little distinction, at least from my perspective, that reliance has always a lot to do with what you do, how you act. I mean, I think you can debate that, whether that's really the point of reliance, but yeah, that would be my